I'm tired. I'm tired of waiting for Wilds to release. My hands won't stop shaking. I need Monster Hunter. Frontier ain't cutting it anymore, man. I need something stronger. I need a new Monster Hunter game. Hello, my name is Eco, and I'm addicted to Monster Hunter. For those in the room with me who've had this feeling before, I come bearing a cautionary tale. Limit your intake. Don't ride the high too hard, or you'll find no satisfaction ever again. If you're like me, desperate to recreate the high of playing Monster Hunter for the first time, you might turn to more dangerous street Monster Hunter instead, and the consequences can be dire. But why is that? Monster Hunter has essentially dominated its genre for 2 decades, and after repeated attempts by multiple different developers to create something similar, nothing is stuck in the same way Monster Hunter has. Compare this to a series like Dark Souls, where, despite its equally genre-defining nature, multiple Souls-like games have released to critical praise and resounding success. What does Monster Hunter have that its competitors struggle to replicate? Why are there no good Monster Hunter-likes? Okay, before we get into the discussion here, I want to preface that when I say these games aren't good Monster Hunter-likes, I mean it literally. I'm not saying the games themselves are bad. Some of the games I'm going to talk about are genuinely fantastic, and I'd recommend everyone give them a shot. What I am saying, however, is that they're not a good alternative to Monster Hunter, not just because of poor quality, but due to a whole slew of factors, which we'll get into. With that out of the way, the first game we're going to look at is Dauntless was the first Monster Hunter-like I ever played. I played it right after Monster Hunter World's release on PS4 and Xbox One back in 2018. I, of course, didn't have either console and was forced to wait for World to release on PC. Feeling the itch to play a new Monster Hunter anyway, I decided to try out this free-to-play Monster Hunter I'd heard about online. I remember having fun with it, but my computer at the time struggled to run it, and after about a month I got tired of the bad frames and stopped playing. Until recently, when I saw some discussion online about the negative reception Dauntless had been receiving due to predatory pay-to-win and crypto. Intrigued by how it had changed since I last played it, I reinstalled it to try it out and oh boy. Dauntless wasn't my favorite game before, but it certainly wasn't the rotting corpse of a game it is right now. For those who haven't played it before, Dauntless takes a lot of inspiration from Monster Hunter. Previously, prioritizing a quest-based system of choosing a specific behemoth, hunting it, and obtaining its materials to craft weapons and armor in order to slay stronger behemoths. I say previously because with Dauntless's latest update, not only are your standard quests no longer a thing, they removed the weapons? What the fuck? As of the latest update, every single weapon in Dauntless, outside of one specific weapon per weapon type, has been removed from the game and can no longer be crafted. But it's okay. Players who had crafted these weapons before the update will get to keep them. As transmog, if you want a new weapon nowadays, you gotta buy it from the store with, you guessed it, real world money. This is one of the design choices of all time. The entire appeal of Monster Hunter is hunting a monster to use its materials to make weapons and armor in order to kill stronger monsters. That is the gameplay loop of Monster Hunter at its core and what makes the game so satisfying to play. Removing half of that formula is just ridiculous. Fret not, however, as Dauntless doesn't need the Monster Hunter gameplay loop in order to offer a sense of progression, no. Dauntless has the Slayer's Path, a progression tree where you can buy upgrades for your character and progress by completing specific NPC quests. These upgrades, of course, help your numbers go up. Rather than creating and enhancing new weapons, killing behemoths will simply level up your weapon to increase its numbers. And killing behemoths will also improve your numbers in the hunting pass to earn sick rewards, like weapons. But only if you buy the premium pass, of course. Numbers, numbers, numbers. That's the biggest issue with Dauntless. Monster Hunter is not a traditional RPG. There is no experience, there aren't any stats you level up, it's just you, your own personal knowledge, and the equipment you forge. When you begin improving in Monster Hunter, it's because you've better honed your skill set, or have learned that flash bombs are extra effective, or made a new set of armor that gives you fucking attack boost 12. Dauntless was very similar, but nowadays it's less about learning the behemoths and more about killing random ones over and over again to level up your weapon, until the game doesn't think you'll get your ass beat anymore. In essence, this is a difference between Dauntless prioritizing extrinsic motivation, whereas Monster Hunter utilizes intrinsic motivation. I get to use my degree! In essence, extrinsic motivation is obtained by offering tangible rewards for progress, like your numbers going up. Intrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is something created by the player. It's the desire to beat the fuck out of Nergigante after he kicked your ass, or to master your weapon combos, or to finalize a new build. It's the self-driven motivation to improve. Now, it's not like Monster Hunter has zero extrinsic motivation, almost every game does. Getting a mantle you've been wanting, or a talisman that optimizes your build, these are examples of extrinsic motivation, but in the long run, it's not the reward that keeps a player coming back, it's the journey to receive the reward. The gradual mastery of a fight and the use of its materials to express yourself in a new way, that's what makes Monster Hunter addictive. It's a healthy balance of motivations. Compare this to Dauntless, which has extrinsic motivation in spades, but neglects the intrinsic motivation that's key for player retention. You can master all the behemoths in Dauntless, but what's the point? Their materials have been made borderline useless, relegated only for armor or as generic materials to stuff into weapon upgrades, so genuinely, what's the point of fighting them all? Some might see this and think, hey, using parts as generic materials? That's what Rise does with its talisman crafting. Why is it good there, but not here? And that's a very astute observation. I really respect you thinking critically about this. The reason it works in Rise is because of another factor we've yet to talk about, the player-monster relationship. I only played a few hours of Dauntless, so I haven't seen all the 43 behemoths the game has to offer, but some of them are pretty cool. The issue is that they all end up feeling generic, and that's not the fault of the art style alone. As an example, my favorite behemoth is this guy. What's his name? I don't fucking know, but we'll get to that. This dude uses these rocks to shield himself from danger, as well as to orient and either shoot them out at you or ram you with them. But, when he does that, part of his body opens up to taking damage. This is a legit interesting fight with a cool mechanic, but the stunted progression system of Dauntless doesn't let him linger in the spotlight. I mean, I just said he's my favorite behemoth, and I couldn't even tell you his name. By removing the ability to hunt specific behemoths and use their gear in the way you want, the player-monster relationship that exists in a game like Monster Hunter simply isn't here. Evident in their materials all being generic upgrade fodder, Dauntless doesn't see its behemoths as special or unique, and as a result, this mindset falls onto the players as well. Ah, you look like just enough XP for a level 10 sword. That's all you're thinking of. Not its name, its ecology, its purpose, just its XP value. Contrast this with Rise's talisman system, where even though any material will suffice in crafting talismans, you as a player at least have the choice of who to fight to get the upgrades you want. Dauntless's abandonment of the quest system makes this far more difficult, and thus the player begins to care less about each individual behemoth. So many players who started with World speak highly of Anjanath. In my opinion, he's one of the more generic monsters in Monster Hunter, but the role he plays for newer players cements him as a memorable fight. He's difficult, he hits hard, and his weapons and armor are really good for that stage of the game. Players are able to develop this relationship because Monster Hunter slows you down and lets you experience the intrinsic motivation of killing the sick-looking dinosaur you saw at the start of the game, while rewarding you extrinsically with this badass gear. Why am I killing this thing who, despite being cool, is gonna give me the same rewards as this guy who just sits there and fucking eats damage for breakfast? The answer is that there is no reason, just like there's no real reason to play this game. And I'll be honest, the saddest part about all of this is that after the first grueling hour or so of being bombarded with information, trying to figure everything out, I found myself genuinely having fun with the game. When you stop looking at Dauntless like a Monster Hunter-like, and instead see it as more of a brain-dead hack and slash, there's legitimately some fun to be had. In my opinion, I also believe Dauntless's ability to swap between weapons mid-hunt makes significantly more sense than it does in Monster Hunter Wilds, at least from what we've seen in the demo thus far. Dauntless's weapons having ability cooldowns that continue counting down even if you aren't using the weapon provides an inherent incentive to swap between weapons to use your abilities and maximize your DPS. This allowed for some fun combos of using my preferred weapon, the sword, then switching to the repeaters when the ability cooldown was up so I could dish out a large burst of damage. But, as we've been discussing, the intrinsic motivation to learn combos like this fades quickly when the only reward I get for doing so is a number on my screen going up. Dauntless somehow managed to transform from a pretty okay Monster Hunter-like to a pointless, grindy mess. And when I say Dauntless, I'm really referring to Fort Labs, the shady crypto company who bought the developers out who also want to make the economy of Animal Crossing real through NFTs. Shit, man, I'm already in debt. I don't need games to put me in debt, too. Look, I'll pay up, I swear. Despite the sometimes interesting ideas Dauntless has going on, I simply can't recommend you play this game in its current state. If you're gonna play a Monster Hunter-like and end up spending money anyway, you should probably just play something like Wild Hearts, EA's attempt at cashing in on the popularity of Monster Hunter. I didn't really have any interest in playing Wild Hearts when it was announced and released, and my interest waned further when I heard that support for the game was pulled only a year after it came out. I assumed that, being an EA product, it probably sucked ass, but after hearing a lot of surprisingly good things about it, I figured I'd give it a shot, and I'm glad I did, as there's certainly a lot to like. Wild Hearts, in principle, feels very, very similar to Monster Hunter, but with a few additional twists to make things fresh. The biggest and most obvious of these twists is the Fortnite building via karakuri, special contraptions made with celestial thread that you're able to conjure with the assistance of your Sekiro-ass hunter's hand. I'm gonna be honest, going into playing Wild Hearts, I assumed that building with the karakuri was gonna feel quite gimmicky, but I was pleasantly surprised by how fluid and natural it felt to use mid-combat, leading to really cool moments where you either get out of the range of an attack or follow up on an advantage. There are 4 different karakuri you can quickly construct, being a box, spring, torch, and a glider, but different combinations of karakuri stacked on top of or next to each other lead to new contraptions as well, like fireworks that function similarly to flash bombs, or a giant spring-loaded hammer or barricade to interrupt attacks and provide defense. These are unlocked through bursts of inspiration, where you'll be fighting a specific kimono, the monsters in Wild Hearts, and you'll suddenly obtain a prompt that both teaches you how to build it and its function. The process of learning these combinations can come off as a bit jarring, but functionally it's a really good way of tutorializing and slowly introducing these different karakuri without overwhelming the player at the start of the game. Karakuri aren't just restricted to combat either. There are plenty of structures you can build as well, like camps that allow you to fast travel wherever you place them, towers to locate kimono that are used in place of something like paintballs or scout flies, and flying threads which allow you to construct a network of zip lines across the different areas of Wild Hearts. These are pretty cool and allow you to design each area to your liking to make hunts as efficient and streamlined as possible, though I did sometimes find the process of getting these karakuri set up to be a bit clunky, especially with the flying threads. Wild Hearts is also home to 8 different weapon types, each playing differently and encouraging different styles of play that range from timing attacks to unleash big damage with the maul, to parrying and dishing back huge damage with the longsword tonfa hybrid that is the bladed wasaga, to the slow and powerful ranged playstyle of the cannon. Some of the weapons feel very analogous to Monster Hunter, but they play differently enough that I still found myself enjoying the process of learning them and how they function here. But what's the point of all these karakuri and weapons? To fight kimono, of course. The kimono in Wild Hearts are honestly nothing special. There are some pretty inspired kimono, like this water-spewing sugar glider or the flame lurker from Demon's Souls, but I didn't find any kimono that really wowed me. In fact, there were 2 kimono you fight somewhat early on that soured my perception of Wild Hearts, but we'll get to that in a bit. Kimono and Wild Hearts also have a distinct anger mechanic where when they're about halfway dead, they essentially enter a phase 2 and begin utilizing new, stronger attacks until they fall, which I think is a really cool distinction from Monster Hunter's on-again, off-again anger system. In general, of all the Monster Hunter likes I played, Wild Hearts follows the Monster Hunter formula the closest. You're able to fight kimono either by traveling to and simply exploring a specific area, sort of like Expeditions in World, or by starting a quest to slay a specific kimono, either from the campfire or the world map. Wild Hearts is additionally multiplayer and has a function similar to World's Signal Flare, where you can request assistance and have up to 2 other players join your session to help you hunt. I had thought that, following the end of support for Wild Hearts, that multiplayer would no longer be an option, but it would seem that only the updates have ceased. Multiplayer is still functional and nearly identical to Monster Hunter. Following a hunt, you're able to use different kimono materials to craft and upgrade weapons and armor. Interestingly enough, Wild Hearts has skills on not only your armor, but your weapons as well, something Monster Hunter will now be mimicking in Wilds. Despite this, these skills aren't anything like Monster Hunter's skills that alter how you play the game, like how Maximum Might encourages players to minimize their stamina use, or Redirection encourages and rewards aggressive skill swapping. Instead, Wild Hearts opts for percentage increases to aspects of your character, like increased damage or faster healing speed. Because of this, I found Wild Hearts to have a lot less build expression, with most of the skills outside of attack improvements being rather inconsequential, but that could also just be because of my preferred playstyle of it. I found this distinction to be not only true of Wild Hearts, but of all the Monster Hunter likes I played. Armor skills in Monster Hunter do a lot for altering how each individual player approaches a hunt, and I feel that the customizability of your build through these skills is something that games attempting to replicate the feel of Monster Hunter don't often give enough weight to. This is especially shocking coming from Wild Hearts in particular, as it can't seem to get enough of trying to be World. Yes, that's right, Wild Hearts has Zorah Magdaros. Earthbreaker. This fight is relatively early on into Wild Hearts, and this is the first fight where my feelings towards the game started to sour a bit. To be clear, Earthbreaker is introduced as far back as the opening scene of the game, so I always knew it was here, but I figured this was an opportunity for Wild Hearts to do something Monster Hunter's failed to do for the 2 decades it's been around. Make siege fights fun. Not only did Wild Hearts manage to make Earthbreaker just as fucking boring as Zorah Magdaros, but they completely fumbled the build-up for this moment as well. I just mentioned that I hate siege fights. I personally dislike how they rip the player out of the traditional gameplay loop in favor of using heavy artillery and, near the end, involve whacking a damage sponge until it dies. In my opinion, it's not very rewarding and feels very samey. Contrast this with something like Gogmazios in MH4U or World's Fatalis fight, where heavy artillery is present and its use encouraged as support, but you're still primarily using your weapon to fight. The weapons you've used and mastered the literal entirety of the game. I think this is what siege fights should strive to be, a twist on the formula Monster Hunter is known for, with the glamour and spectacle that makes siege fights so memorable in the first place. And I want to emphasize the importance of spectacle here, as for a siege fight, spectacle is equally as important as the fight being fun. A siege fight is supposed to represent a fight against the odds, David versus Goliath, the struggle to win. That's what makes them different from a normal fight. Zorah Magdaros, despite being fucking awful and boring to fight, has spectacle down to a T. Zorah Magdaros is built up in the opening scene of World.
Wow, what a coincidence.
Sees the player investigating their whereabouts, fighting and failing to stop it the first time, only to increase the stakes to a do-or-die situation where everything comes together to halt the progress of this hulking mountain. That is built up in spectacle, and what makes Zorah Magdaros a memorable siege fight. Earthbreaker, on the other hand. Earthbreaker removes player control in two key ways. You're forced to use the cannon, and all of the katakuri you need are already placed for you. Literally, even the one gimmick that makes Wild Hearts remotely unique, they remove control from the player. Let me Fortnite build onto the big monster and whack it, goddammit, that would be sick as fuck. Maybe instead of something like the ballista binders in Monster Hunter, the flying thread could hold it in place and give you the opportunity to damage it while it's immobilized, or allow you to zipline on top of it from there. Of course, you are able to get on top of Earthbreaker, but only after the game spawns in the flying thread for you. Now, to give Wild Hearts a bit of credit, Zorah Magdaros was already an impressive technological feat. I can't imagine the difficulty in programming the player's ability to walk and attack on top of a monster like that. The pre-placed katakuri on Earthbreaker is likely a technological limitation. I can forgive that, but why did they place the rest of this network for me then? Would the adrenaline of utilizing all the katakuri you've learned to rush back to Earthbreaker after he gets out of your sights be too much fun? And then, fucking then, after you deal enough damage, the big do-or-die moment, he's screaming and... Why he look like that? You bust out your weapon, you ready yourself, and 9 hits. It took me 9 hits to kill him. How? How is it possible to fuck up a fight this bad? I want to be clear. In my playthrough of Wild Hearts up to this point, I barely did any additional side content. My weapons weren't maxed out, I didn't have optimal armor skills, I didn't even use the eating mechanic to buff my stats or anything. This was all it took. After this big letdown of a fight, you're introduced to a new kimono, Sporetail, which is just a subspecies of the first kimono you fight in the game, and this is where I felt I'd seen enough. I've made my opinion on subspecies clear in my video about recycled content, but just to clarify, I think subspecies can be a cool way of repurposing a fight or making early game monsters more menacing later on, but only when done right. Seeing Wild Hearts introducing subspecies this early into the game, however, right after the Zorah Magdaros wannabe, cemented to me that Wild Hearts was intent on copying World with as few resources as possible, and made me wish I was just playing World instead. In general, Wild Hearts just feels like a less polished World, with less variety in weapons, armor skills, and monsters, and only attempting to make up for this with Fortnite. Similar to my feelings towards Dauntless, I thought that Wild Hearts was legitimately very fun at times, with the novelty and fluidity of using katakuri still being a personal highlight of mine. My biggest issue after playing for long enough was that Wild Hearts felt too similar to Monster Hunter, that the developers were attempting to recreate the highs of World without factoring in how it could be improved or made to fit within the legitimately unique and interesting world that they built. It might sound a bit ridiculous to complain that a Monster Hunter-like is too similar to Monster Hunter, but that's the thing. I want a Monster Hunter-like, not a Monster Hunter clone. The only thing that these similarities serve to do is exacerbate the ways in which Wild Hearts fails to meet the standards Monster Hunter has put forwards. It fails to answer the question of why I should play Wild Hearts over Monster Hunter at all. In today's AAA landscape, where maximizing profit through any means necessary is a priority, getting and maintaining the momentum for a series like Monster Hunter isn't easy, and I feel that a lot of companies, in their mission to maximize profit, understandably shy away from risky endeavors that might blossom into something better down the line. This line of reasoning, however, doesn't allow for growth or improvement. The OG Monster Hunter is a clunky, shitty mess, and we would never know how good Monster Hunter could be if the developers had stopped there. With continued support for Wild Hearts being canned so early into its life, I think it's likely we'll never get a sequel that could have fixed a lot of these issues or expanded the universe of Wild Hearts more, and that's a damn shame, as in another timeline, I could have seen Wild Hearts being a legit competitor for Monster Hunter. If you don't care about a Monster Hunter-like being too similar to a better game you've already played, there are some interesting ideas in Wild Hearts that might make it worth your while. I do feel obligated to mention, however, that I've avoided discussing the performance issues of Wild Hearts throughout this entire section, as I wanted to focus on the comparison of its gameplay and mechanics, but if you're playing on PC, Wild Hearts is going to run like shit sometimes, no getting around it, I checked. Just a heads up if you're interested in or are planning on getting it. Anywho, keeping up with the trend of your hand doing some fuck-ass shit, we got Toukiden 2, a Monster Hunter-like from the company who brought you Toukiden. And also Dynasty Warriors, I guess. Now, I've never played the first Toukiden, nor have I ever played a Dynasty Warriors game, but I'd heard that Toukiden was a pretty solid Monster Hunter-like and wanted to give it a shot. Toukiden takes a much more action-focused approach to the Monster Hunter formula, maintaining the concept of hunting Oni and using their materials to craft different weapons and armor, but with a few additional twists. For starters, unlike Monster Hunter, Dauntless, or Wild Hearts, armor in Toukiden only provides defense and elemental resistances, no armor skills. Skills in Toukiden are instead utilized passively or actively within combat and are customizable based on your equipped Maitama, the souls of dead slayers who reside within you to grant you power. As a result of this, there's a fuckload of customizability right off the bat with 11 different weapon types and 11 different combat styles like attack, defense, speed, luck? Space? What the fuck? Maitama can be easily mixed and matched to provide a unique combat style, an evasion skill, and an offensive skill, and that's not even considering that certain combinations are stronger because of the connection Maitama share with each other. In truth, it's all a bit overwhelming, but the customizability and the ability to create different synergies is a pretty cool alternative to Monster Hunter's armor skills, though I'd argue that in practice, it tends to be much shallower in depth than Monster Hunter. This is because the skills in Toukiden are often supplementary, assisting or bolstering certain aspects of the game's combat, rather than altering how a player would go about engaging with an Oni, which I find to be less impactful overall. As for the weapons, I will say that despite each of them playing differently, they share a lot of similarities in a way Monster Hunter's weapons don't. For instance, every weapon has a destroyer attack, a special attack that, once built up, is able to destroy the body part of any Oni that it hits. Likewise, almost every weapon possesses some sort of defensive maneuver, whether it be a guard, parry, or evade, as well as a weak attack, strong attack, special attack system, encouraging players to utilize and combine different attack types mid-hunt. The exception to this system is the rifle, a ranged weapon that instead encourages loading up a bunch of different ammos into your clip and swapping them when appropriate. Because of this, even though the combos, timings, and swings are different for each weapon, it can sometimes feel a bit samey across the board. Though I never found any of the weapons to be bland or anything, Toukiden 2 does lack the depth that makes Monster Hunter's weapons so gratifying to use. Toukiden 2 makes up for this by granting you the use of something called the Demon Hand, essentially a spooky grappling hook that you can use to pull yourself back into the action with, as well as knock Oni down mid-attack when they flash red. The Demon Hand encourages a highly aggressive playstyle where you're always in an Oni's face dealing damage and can make for pretty fun fights. An aspect of the Demon Hand that I really love is the Oni Burial, where when this blue gauge is maxed out, you can target a body part of the Oni and perform a flashy attack that permanently destroys it, changing how the Oni is able to move around and attack. This is a concept that Monster Hunter does occasionally, like how breaking Burial's wings slows him down when he leaps, but Toukiden takes this to another level. You can destroy an Oni's wings and force it to the ground for the rest of the fight, or slice off its legs to make it crawl in order to reach its other body parts. It's legitimately very cool, and something I wish Monster Hunter leaned more into, but breaking parts in Toukiden plays a larger role than just affecting the moveset of the Oni you're fighting. In Monster Hunter, the goal of a hunt is to hit the monster until it dies, right? It's the same in Toukiden, only hitting an Oni isn't what damages it, at least not initially. Breaking body parts does. Your goal in Toukiden is to sever off parts of an Oni in order to reveal its true essence, opening it up for damage, hence the ubiquity of those destroyer attacks. In my opinion, this is a really interesting distinction. Monster Hunter often has its hunters target specific parts in order to break them for unique drops, but once that task is done, most players simply continue hacking away at the best hit zone. While the aspect of breaking parts for items is no different here, Toukiden largely punishes this approach, encouraging players to attack from different angles to break every part they can, opening you up to new attacks and risks at the same time. Similar to Wild Hearts, Toukiden also uses a rampage mechanic, where each Oni has a phase 2 once it's halfway dead, where it gains new attacks, regrows its broken parts, and sometimes gains new parts as well. Interestingly, a system like this where monsters grow and regrow their parts wouldn't work to nearly the same effect in Monster Hunter, as most of the monsters are grounded heavily by their ecology. They're just animals living in the world after all. Toukiden, however, doesn't see its Oni through the lens of ecology. Oni are time-leaping demons who've killed the vast majority of humanity and have no grounded rules that need following, allowing for these drastic phase changes and dramatic fights that aren't really possible within the context of something like Monster Hunter. There is a downside to this approach, however, which is that I found myself often blasting through Oni without really appreciating each fight. Without something like ecology to ground things out, Toukiden almost suffers from the Dauntless issue of Oni simply being fodder for you to either get through or grow stronger with. I say almost because Toukiden avoids this by not fucking removing the weapons for starters, but by instead grounding and making its Oni memorable through its story. Toukiden is significantly more story-driven than Monster Hunter. Toukiden offers a quest board where you can fight specific Oni, as well as optional quests given by NPCs to help upgrade the town, but the quest board is basically relegated to optional quests for obtaining better weapons and armor. There's always a main story quest out in the world that you can complete to progress. The story itself is organized into chapters, similar to something like Yakuza, where completing specific story beats moves the plot and the player's progression forwards. I won't get into all the story details here, but it's certainly something and gets batshit crazy very fast. We're talking time travel, class war, attempted revolution, the resurrection of a god, you name it. Despite the premise, the story is actually nothing spectacular, but it leads to a lot of interesting world building, heartfelt character moments, and some comedy, though that was largely hit or miss for me. All of this is in direct contrast with Monster Hunter, whose story has almost always either been non-existent or just serviceable. It's not to say that the stories in Monster Hunter are bad. I mean, MH4U is almost universally loved for this, and from some of the trailers, Wilds seems like it'll be largely story-focused as well, but they're quite paltry when compared to Toukiden. A good comparison between MH4U and Toukiden, however, is the way in which the story integrates what you fight. Gore Magala is a very popular monster, and I have no doubt that a large part of its popularity is due to its role in MH4U's story, being this unknown looming threat that's infecting other monsters, or, if you're to believe the lore, procreating. There's no single Oni comparable to something like Gore Magala and Toukiden, but there are parts of the story where an Oni will come to the village and murder people, or show up and threaten to murder people, or threaten to get your friend falsely convicted on the count of murder, all of which results in you and your ragtag team of companions running into the otherworld to get your revenge. This leads to story-important Oni being a lot more memorable in your mind, like, this is the one who killed this lady's dad, that's epic, helping to make certain fights stick out in a way that something like Dauntless simply can't, which I think is a good thing, even if some of the story beats did begin to feel a bit repetitive after a while. Now, I've sung a lot of praise for Toukiden, and it's definitely warranted, but there are still parts of the game that I didn't find very fun. The biggest offender for me is the Otherworld. The Otherworld is where the Oni reside, and you're able to jaunt out whenever you want to fight Oni, explore, collect materials, and talk with NPCs for side quests in a more open-world fashion than Monster Hunter. I really like the concept of the Otherworld, and using your exposure to toxic miasma produced by the Oni as a replacement for Monster Hunter's quest time limits is quite brilliant, but man, there is not a lot out there. When you're trying to progress in the story, you'll find yourself in a repetitive cycle of going into the Otherworld to fight an Oni, returning to the village, then having to run all the way back out into the Otherworld to fight something else or close a hole. Given the combat style of Toukiden, as well as the Dynasty Warriors chops of the developers, these wide open areas make sense, but only when you're fighting. Running from point A to point B felt tedious more often than not, and though there are plenty of small Oni to block the way, I usually just found myself running past everything to avoid wasting more time. There are eventually warp stones you can access, which can be fast traveled between, but by the time you unlock a warp stone for a specific age, the story has moved on somewhere else, offering little incentive to return outside of gathering materials. Compared to Monster Hunter's smaller and more dense areas, Toukiden's Otherworld can feel very pointless and empty, and I often found myself wondering why they didn't just make it smaller. I also had quite a bit of an issue with the game giving tutorial prompts in the middle of combat. As somebody completely new to Toukiden, I was pretty overwhelmed at the start of the game, trying to balance not getting my ass kicked while putting into practice all of the information they were dumping my way. A lot of these tutorials didn't even help, as I still found myself needing to browse the in-game tutorial guide and complete some of the training quests to fully grasp what I was doing. Maybe I just suck at video games, that's always a possibility, but Toukiden's gameplay only fully clicked for me after playing for about 3 hours or so. Toukiden has a lot of interesting and unique mechanics, and almost all of them are really fun when you start to sink your teeth into them, but they probably could have found a more gentle way of getting the ball rolling. Or just opened the doors to allow players to immediately try some of the training quests to get a grasp of their capabilities on their own. In general, as far as Monster Hunter likes go, Toukiden is honestly pretty close to scratching that Monster Hunter itch for me, but outside of the overall lack of depth in some of its mechanics, I couldn't help but feel like something was missing, and I'll be honest, it took a lot of deliberation to find out why. This is definitely a more subjective take, and I 100% understand if you disagree, but I think that Toukiden's hard lean into Oni, Machina, and other supernatural happenings, while fantastic for diversifying itself from Monster Hunter, lacks the imaginative realism that grounds the Monster Hunter world for me. As I mentioned before, the Oni are time-jumping demons here to destroy humanity, whereas something like Dorogama's just a fucking lizard, and I feel that this distinction alters how we perceive each respective world. Toukiden is a fight for survival, for the fate of your village and the future of humanity, whereas games like Monster Hunter and Wild Hearts, though possessing equally larger-than-life monsters with what we would consider supernatural abilities, keep things realistic by offering imaginative, ecological explanations, assisting in suspending your disbelief. This kind of gets into immersion talk, which I honestly fucking hate, as immersion isn't something a developer can just implement, it's something that's born from a player's interest in a game and the world it's set in. I simply think that Monster Hunter offers more opportunity to explore the intricacies of the world than Toukiden does. Monster Hunter takes care to explain that Rajang gets its lightning powers by eating the horns of Kirin, but nothing is done to explain why this Oni can shoot lightning, and as far as Toukiden is concerned, whether this Oni shoots lightning or not is irrelevant, as it killed this girl's dad and has to die. Don't get me wrong, I don't think Toukiden's approach is bad. Specific Oni play pivotal roles in Toukiden's story, which we've established is a large priority for the game, and I can 100% seize Toukiden's story and characters offering a level of immersion commensurate to Monster Hunter for many players. For me though, personally, I just don't get as much out of it as I do the pseudo-realistic world building of Monster Hunter. Now, with all of that out of the way, I'm still confident in saying that Toukiden 2 is by far my favorite Monster Hunter-like, and I'll probably end up getting around to playing Toukiden Kiwami as well. I feel like I dedicated a lot of time talking about the things I didn't like about Toukiden, but I really wanted to get across my exact feelings the best I could, as I found trying to explain the things I didn't like to be quite difficult, as there's not really that much here to hate. Toukiden 2 is a very solid game. If you're also down bad for Wilds and need something to hold you over, seriously, consider giving Toukiden 2 a shot. It won't replace Monster Hunter or anything, but it's a great game. If you're looking for another good game with a 2 in it, look no further than... I first played and beat Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen around the end of 2023, and I very recently played through its sequel. Dragon's Dogma isn't a Monster Hunter-like in the traditional sense, but being Monster Hunter's cousin from the same mother, as well as an incredible game in its own right, there are a lot of similarities that I think are worth looking at to see what Dragon's Dogma is doing right that some of the former games simply aren't. For starters, Dragon's Dogma, similar to Monster Hunter, excels in offering different styles of play. Dragon's Dogma is home to a number of different vocations, each altering what weapons and armors you can use, the skills you can equip, and the types of damage you can deal. In a sense, vocations are largely analogous to Monster Hunter's different weapon types. Unlike Monster Hunter, however, where each weapon type is viable in its own right, many of Dragon's Dogma's vocations serve to fulfill a specific role and are balanced to work alongside different vocations. This is an important distinction, given that you have control of not only your own pawn, a customizable AI companion, but you can hire the services of 2 additional pawns from other players as well. A large focus of Dragon's Dogma is in this team building, finding a combination of vocations for yourself and the pawns you hire that offer a strong offensive, defensive, and supportive core. This is essential because many enemies in Dragon's Dogma are going to be resistant to one of or all of your specific damage type. Take golems, for instance, which are almost completely immune to magic damage of any kind, yet crumble in the face of physical damage. This is completely unlike Monster Hunter, and part of the reason why I'm hesitant to call Dragon's Dogma Monster Hunter-like at all. Yes, Monster Hunter has elemental weaknesses and resistances, as well as some monsters being completely immune to certain ailments, but there's no monster that's just immune to longsword. Unfortunately. This is because Monster Hunter, despite being a multiplayer experience, often prioritizes individuality, where any player's specific build and playstyle can work. Dragon's Dogma takes that concept and spits on it, expecting players to either change things up for different situations or die. And thanks to this fundamentally different take on combat, Dragon's Dogma's vocations are able to change up gameplay in ways Monster Hunter simply can't. Take the Trickster vocation, for example, a vocation literally designed to deal 0 damage. Your goal as a Trickster is to create illusions to confuse the enemy AI, buff your pawns, and take aggro off of them while they finish the job for you. Given that every weapon in Monster Hunter needs to, kill the monster, a playstyle like this simply isn't feasible in Monster Hunter, ironically turning the philosophy that every weapon should be viable into a millstone that serves only to limit player expression in comparison. But of course, I don't think it's a bad thing that Monster Hunter can't have a playstyle like the Trickster. As I've said, these 2 games are fundamentally different, and a fully supportive playstyle just isn't what Monster Hunter is all about, though I'm sure the wide-range Mushroom-Mancer builds will tell me otherwise. But let's go back a bit and talk about the multiplayer aspect of Monster Hunter itself. Dragon's Dogma is not a multiplayer game in the traditional sense. In-game, it's only you and your AI pawns. There are no other real players in your party. Dragon's Dogma's multiplayer comes in what pawns you have access to and any specific skills and knowledge that other pawns have that you lack. Pawns gain knowledge and skills at the behest of their masters or other players who've hired and used them. Pawns will often make comments like, "I'll have to tell my own master about this," or "I never thought of that strategy. These lines of dialogue happen when you find a secret, or you find a new way of killing or taking down an enemy. These actions increase a pawn's knowledge, allowing them to use these strategies themselves and inform others of them when they're newly hired and used. This system, though very cool, has its ups and downs. Experienced pawns are able to readily guide players to quest locations and hidden secrets, but other quote-unquote experienced pawns will sometimes employ, dubious strategies. And you know me, I want all of my pawns to be optimal. I would never taint the knowledge of my pawns. I would never. Despite us, allegedly, not being AI robots, there's a lot of similarities in passing knowledge through multiplayer and Monster Hunter as well. It was through multiplayer hunts that I learned of the efficacy of flash bombs against Rathalos, the fact that you can cut off Basarios' tail, the utter fucking importance of flinch-free, I wanna play the game! In both Monster Hunter and Dragon's Dogma, multiplayer can serve as a way to better everybody through shared knowledge and experience, though Dragon's Dogma takes a more roundabout approach. The last similarity between Monster Hunter and Dragon's Dogma, and a large part of why I've included it in this discussion, is its emphasis on preparation. One element of Monster Hunter that I've traditionally admired, even though it's slowly being faded out of the game, was the pre-hunt preparation. Ensuring you have all of your potions and combo books, materials to craft more potions or ammo, flash bombs, shock traps, getting all of your ducks in a row before a hunt was interesting because of the detriment that not being properly equipped could pose. But, with the introduction of World, players can now eat food and replenish items out on a quest, ultimately removing this aspect from the game entirely. Now, I'll be honest, I really hated this change when it initially came to World, but I've since softened a lot on the concept. The scope of Monster Hunter has been changing drastically, and punishing underprepared players by forcing them to abandon the quest and then just rejoin a minute later, it's just a pointless annoyance. Despite this, I still wish there was more consequence for being ill-prepared, as I feel it fits the tone of the game more, which is why I deeply admire the way Dragon's Dogma shits all over you for rushing out into the world on a whim. For starters, in Dragon's Dogma 2 specifically, health is not always replenishable. When you take damage, though lots can be recovered through spells or curatives, you will always take a little bit of permanent damage that decreases your effective max health, and there is zero way of replenishing this, outside of resting at an inn or setting up and resting at a campsite. This forces players who engage in too many battles to eventually reach a point where combat is simply too risky to engage in anymore, requiring players retreat to town. Dragon's Dogma additionally has a weight system where every item and piece of equipment in the game has its own carry weight. You can only carry so much before your movement and stamina recovery is hindered, which has the effect of limiting your effectiveness in combat, your ability to escape conflict, and how many items, whether they be curatives, upgrade materials, or camping kits, you can carry at a time. In concept, I find Dragon's Dogma's restriction on health and inventory similar to older Monster Hunter games, where you can only carry so much with you and have an effective quote-unquote limit to how much damage you can take, due to the restriction on how many potions you can bring. This leads to an interesting balance of bringing enough to survive, but leaving enough space to reap the reward after your hunt is over. But of course, Dragon's Dogma, unlike Monster Hunter, isn't a quest-based game. It's an open-world experience with a save feature. Aren't you able to just save before a boss and try it over and over again? Well, technically yes, but the game doesn't make that easy for you. If you die in combat and choose to restart at your last save, your max health will be lower than it was when you saved, effectively punishing the player for trying to save scum and beat bosses they aren't properly prepared for. This can be circumvented by just Alt F4ing and booting the game up if you die, but I often found that this was too annoying and that I didn't really care enough. I can see some people really hating this design choice, but I think that it's an effective anti-cheese mechanic that further drives home how much Dragon's Dogma wants its players to plan and be prepared, whether it be to fight or to retreat when they bite off more than they can chew. In conclusion, though Dragon's Dogma is a fundamentally different experience from Monster Hunter, it shares a number of similar values and has just enough in common for me to consider an actually pretty okay example of a Monster Hunter-like, at least in spirit. If you disagree, I get it, but I still recommend you try Dragon's Dogma if you haven't. Whether it be the first or second, they're masterworks all, can't go wrong. Exciting and diverse combat, player expression and customizability, skill progression and the preparation for success, craftable fucking weapon. Long ago, these four gameplay elements lived together in harmony. Then, everything changed when the Monster Hunter likes attacked. Only Monster Hunter, master of all four elements, could stand the test of time, but when the world needed it most, it vanished. But we'll be back in February. In my opinion, this is largely the reason why there haven't been any astounding Monster Hunter likes. Monster Hunter is a phenomenal blend of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, where players want to improve at the game to kill cool monsters and make a build that works best for them, to play with their friends and overcome difficult fights, to learn about the monsters that call this world their home. This is a formula that's not easily replicated. I think each Monster Hunter like we've talked about has some element of the Monster Hunter formula it excels at, but nothing brings it all together like the King. Monster Hunter has been around long enough at this point where I don't realistically think there's ever going to be a series that topples the king from his throne, but hopefully that doesn't stop developers from putting their own spin on things and creating new and exciting worlds for all of us to explore. The more Monster Hunter the better, after all. But, until then, I'll just have to chase my high in another way. Yeah, so I'm just gonna be doing this. Call me when Wilds comes out.